This may be a bit personal for a press conference, but since Miss Fonda started it in her...
At 86, Jane Fonda no longer speaks with the urgency of youth. Her voice, though slower now, carries something sharper than time truth. In a quiet interview recorded at her Los Angeles home, she finally uttered the words she had swallowed for half a century. "I loved Robert Redford even when he didn't know." For the world, it was just another confession from a star reflecting on her past. But for those who had watched them on screen barefoot in the park, riding under desert skies, or lying side by side in our souls at night, it felt like an earthquake disguised as a whisper. Because behind those perfect images of cinematic romance hid a love story Hollywood never allowed to exist. They were the last rebels of their generation, two people who had challenged systems, lovers, politics, and age itself. Yet when it came to each other, they chose restraint over rebellion. And that is where their tragedy began. In the 1,960 seconds, the world saw Robert Redford and Jane Fonda as the ideal opposites, his silence against her fire, his restraint against her raw truth. He was the golden boy of American cinema. She the daughter of a dynasty turned activist, too passionate to be contained. Together, they embodied everything Hollywood worshipped but secretly feared: youth with conviction. Their chemistry was undeniable. In Barefoot in the Park, 1967, their laughter became part of the nation's heartbeat. He disciplined, guarded, a man who hid behind his roles. She impulsive, radiant, and brave enough to speak what he wouldn't. And yet, somewhere in those rehearsed kisses and staged quarrels, something real took root, something neither of them dared to name. Decades later, when Fonda looked back, she said it quietly, like an apology to time itself. "He was my favorite partner and my biggest heartbreak, because he never let me in." The irony is brutal. Two icons who fought every form of oppression, sexism, censorship, political control could not escape the one tyranny that ruled them both: fear. The fear of crossing a line that could destroy everything they had built. The fear that love, once confessed, might not survive the light. For 50 years, they met again and again through film, always close, never together. And every reunion became another chapter of the same unfinished story. Their last collaboration, Our Souls at Night, 2017, felt less like a movie than a confession in motion. Two aging souls rehearsing the love they never lived. Behind the camera, crew members recalled moments of silence so heavy it felt sacred. They didn't need to act. One said, they were remembering. When Jane Fonda finally spoke, she didn't accuse or dramatize. She smiled. "I used to think I wasn't enough for him," she said. "Now I know he simply didn't know how to love back." Hollywood called it nostalgia, but those who understood saw something else: the quiet triumph of a woman who forgave time itself. Because in the end, the greatest love stories are not the ones that end in embrace, but the ones that survive as truth. And so begins the last dance of two rebels, the story of a man and a woman who spent 50 years circling around love, until time forced them to finally meet it face to face. The camera of time moves backward to a decade when beauty was a weapon and restraint, an armor. It was the late 1960 seconds. Hollywood was burning with color, and two names glowed brighter than all others: Robert Redford and Jane Fonda. They were both young, beautiful, and dangerously intelligent. To the public, they were the perfect pair, the kind of people who seemed born for each other, sculpted by the same light. But in truth, they were mirrors that reflected what the other feared most. Redford, at 30, was already a myth in the making: blonde, stoic, his silence mistaken for mystery. Behind that calm exterior was a man obsessed with control, terrified of chaos, and quietly distrustful of love. He believed intimacy was a form of vulnerability, and vulnerability, to him, was defeat. Jane, meanwhile, was the opposite force of nature. She entered every room like a storm disguised as sunlight. Her father's legacy, Henry Fonda, the American hero, was both blessing and burden. She grew up among cameras and ghosts, learning early that perfection is often the prettiest prison. When she met Redford on the set of Barefoot in the Park in 1967, she later said, "I felt safe with him, too safe." Maybe. That film would become the world's illusion, a love story so alive, so effortless, that audiences believed they were watching two souls fall for each other in real time. Every look, every touch, every pause between lines seemed charged with something unscripted. But what the world didn't know was that this electricity came not from romance, but from tension, from two people pretending so well that they almost believed it themselves. Between takes, they rarely spoke beyond the script. Redford kept to himself, polite but distant, while Fonda tried to break the ice with jokes that slid off his composure like rain on glass. He would smile, nod, and then disappear into silence. She found that silence intoxicating and infuriating. In later interviews, she admitted, "I wanted him to look at me not as a co-star, not as a friend, but as a woman. He never did. Not once." Yet the camera captured what reality denied. On screen, their laughter seemed genuine, their arguments tender. The illusion was perfect, and perhaps that's why it lasted so long. When Barefoot in the Park premiered, critics called their chemistry miraculous. But behind the red carpet, smiles. Both carried invisible bruises. Fonda was battling the shadows of her father's emotional distance and the suffocating expectations of fame. Redford was hiding his own grief, the loss of a child, the quiet disintegration of a marriage, and the growing fear that he could never truly belong to anyone. They were two people celebrated for their connection, yet incapable of connection itself. Still, fate, or perhaps irony, refused to let them go. A decade later, they were cast together again in The Electric Horseman, 1979, and time had changed them both. Fonda had become a revolutionary voice, outspoken, politically charged, unafraid to be hated. Redford had turned inward, becoming the quiet conscience of American cinema, building Sundance as a sanctuary for truth seekers. And once again, their paths collided, two different kinds of fire meeting under a fading sun. On set, there was affection, but also friction. She teased him for being too stiff. He told her she thought too much. But something deeper was happening, the unspoken acknowledgement that they understood each other more than anyone else ever could. Still, neither dared to break the pattern. As one assistant recalled, they had a language made of glances. It was beautiful and sad, like two people dancing, each afraid to lead. The Electric Horseman wrapped, and so did that chapter of their lives. They went on with their separate crusades, he for environmental justice, she for women's rights and peace. Years passed. Marriages ended. Causes rose and fell. And yet, every few years, when their names appeared side by side in a news article or an award tribute, people felt the same strange tug that something between them had never been finished. It wasn't until 2017, 50 years after their first film together, that they met again, this time for Our Souls at Night. By then, they were no longer movie stars trying to conquer the world. They were survivors of fame, of loss, of themselves. And for the first time, the illusion began to crack. In Our Souls at Night, two lonely widows reconnect after decades apart, a script that eerily mirrored their own lives. There was no glamour now, no youthful glow, just wrinkled hands, slower steps, and eyes filled with unspoken memory. During filming, There were moments when the crew stopped breathing, the way she looked at him, the way he avoided her gaze, the way both seemed to know they were performing their final duet. A journalist later wrote, "It wasn't acting. It was reckoning." Because what they were filming was not fiction. It was atonement. When the movie wrapped, Redford gave a rare interview. He said softly, "Working with Jane again reminded me of everything I missed the first time." It was not a confession, but something close, a crack in the armor that had taken a lifetime to maintain. Jane responded simply, "I've loved him in every stage of his life. I think he knows that now." The illusion was over. What remained was raw, imperfect truth that love, when unspoken too long, doesn't die. It just waits quietly, stubbornly, until two souls are finally old enough to tell it without fear. When Jane Fonda speaks about Robert Redford today, her tone carries something almost maternal, the gentleness of a woman who has stopped expecting and started understanding. But there was a time when her love for him was not peaceful at all. It was restless, hungry, and quietly aching, the kind of love that feeds on what is never said. Their story was never a romance written in letters or gestures. It existed in the space between scenes, the pauses that editors cut away. Behind every smile on screen, there was an invisible pulse, a heartbeat, asking, "Do you feel it too?" But Redford, the eternal minimalist, was a man built of silences. He had learned early that emotions were dangerous, that the world respected men who hid rather than confessed. He lost a child in his 20s, a grief that welded his heart shut. He rarely spoke of it, but those who worked with him could feel it, a sadness too disciplined to show itself. Jane, meanwhile, had spent her life doing the opposite, tearing herself open in public. Her activism, her marriages, her failures, everything about her was loud, political, exposed. But what few people understood was that behind that fire was a desperate need to be seen, not as an icon, not as a headline, but as a woman who simply wanted to be held without judgment. In Redford, she saw that possibility and the impossibility of it. Their connection was a paradox, magnetic, yet cautious, full of feeling, yet restrained by pride. He admired her fearlessness, but it also frightened him. She loved his steadiness, but it drove her mad. On the surface, they were perfect, two intellectual equals, both committed to art and purpose. Yet deep down, they were speaking different emotional languages. During The Electric Horseman, she tried once more to break through. One evening after filming, she found him sitting alone under the desert sky, cigarette smoke curling around the dim light of a trailer. She sat beside him, knees touching sand, and said, "You know, I wish we weren't always performing." He didn't answer right away. He took a drag, exhaled, and said quietly, "We're actors. Jane, that's all we know how to do." That was Redford's tragedy, the man who could express everything through film, but almost nothing in real life. And so Jane became the silent witness of a love that never allowed itself to exist. In interviews decades later, she laughed about it with grace. He didn't like kissing on camera. He said, "I always came in too fast." But then she added, almost whispering, "I think he was afraid of what would happen if he didn't stop me." There is a certain cruelty in unspoken love. It grows old without ever being born. Every time they worked together, Jane would search his eyes for a hint of vulnerability, and he would hide behind professionalism. Every time she reached for emotion, he retreated to logic. It wasn't arrogance. It was fear, the fear of losing control, the fear of being known too well. Redford once said in a rare confession, "Fame isolates you. You spend your life surrounded by people who love your image, not your flaws." Jane understood that too well. Fame had cost her marriages, her peace, her sense of self. Perhaps that's why, even when he turned away, she never stopped understanding him. Because love, real love, is not always about being chosen. Sometimes it's about seeing someone clearly when the rest of the world only sees the mask. In many ways, they were reflections of an era, the 1,960 seconds dreamers who turned into 1,970 seconds survivors. Both tried to use art to tell the truth and ended up hiding inside it. Redford escaped into directing, chasing purity through stories about justice and solitude. Fonda turned to activism, screaming her truth on the world stage when she couldn't whisper it in private. Each fought for meaning, and each lost pieces of themselves along the way. There's a photo from 1979 taken on the set of The Electric Horseman that captures their emotional geography better than words ever could. He's standing slightly behind her, half smiling, eyes soft but distant. She's laughing, tilting her head toward him, unaware that he isn't looking at her, but it's something just beyond. That distance, half a step, half a glance is the story of their lives. Years later, Jane would tell a friend, "I think I love the idea of him more than the man himself, because the man, he was always somewhere else." Yet that distance became their language. They didn't need to hold hands to feel connected. The silence between them was louder than any confession. When our souls at night began shooting, that silence returned older now, but no less potent. On the first day of filming, Fonda approached him with a smile and said, "You still make me nervous." He laughed the same reserved laugh she remembered from 50 years before. "You still talk too much," he replied. And just like that, they fell back into their rhythm, tender, teasing, tragic. But this time, something had changed. Age had softened their pride. Mortality had stripped away performance. They no longer had to pretend to be perfect, only present. In one scene, where their characters lie in bed, talking about the years they wasted being afraid, the line blurred completely between fiction and memory. Jane later admitted, "That wasn't acting. That was us." The crew felt it too, the emotional gravity of two legends finally telling the truth through someone else's words. When the camera stopped, Redford turned to her and said quietly, "We did all right, didn't we?" Fonda nodded. "Yes, even when we didn't." That moment, brief, almost ordinary, was their unspoken reconciliation. No grand declarations, no dramatic embrace, just mutual recognition, the kind that only comes after decades of misunderstanding. For Fonda, it was closure without ending. For Redford, perhaps redemption, because deep down, she had always been his mirror, the one person who saw past the myth of Robert Redford, the movie God, and recognized the lonely boy behind it. And maybe, in his own quiet way, he loved her for that, but neither of them said it. They didn't have to. Some loves are too sacred for language. When Our Souls at Night premiered, critics called it a love letter to aging. But those who knew better felt something else, the ache of unfinished sentences, the tenderness of time forgiving itself. It wasn't a love story. It was the echo of one. As the credits rolled, Jane looked across the theater and saw Redford sitting alone. Watching the final scene, their two characters lying side by side in the dark, hands almost touching. For a second, he turned and met her eyes. She smiled. He smiled back. And in that fleeting glance, 50 years of silence finally spoke. For 50 years, the world believed they had simply acted two legends performing chemistry as skillfully as dialogue. But the truth, quiet and unpublicized, lived elsewhere. It lived in the things they never said, and in the things they finally did. The revelation did not come in a headline or an interview. It came in a silence, the kind that arrives when two people have nothing left to prove. During the final weeks of Our Souls at Night, Robert Redford invited Jane Fonda to dinner at his home in Sundance, Utah. It was not a glamorous event, just the two of them, a bottle of wine, and the sound of wind scraping the windows. After decades of press tours and studio lights, this was the first time they were alone without a script. Fonda later recalled that he cooked trout, too dry. She laughed. But sweet? They talked about everything except the film's politics, children, climate, faith, regret. And then, near the end, the conversation slowed. Redford stared into the fire for a long time before saying, "You know, Jane, I always thought we'd have more time." It was not a confession of love, not exactly. It was an admission of what silence had cost. Fonda didn't cry. She just nodded, eyes glimmering in the reflection of the firelight. "We did what we could," she said softly. "We were afraid of the same thing, losing control. Only difference is, you lost love for it. I lost peace." For a moment, the air between them trembled, not with nostalgia, but with understanding. Two rebels who had fought the world finally surrendered to the one battle they could never win, the passing of time. That was the biggest shock, not a scandal, not a secret affair, but the realization that even the fiercest spirits cannot outrun their own humanity. They were heroes on screen, revolutionaries in spirit, but when faced with love, they were just people afraid, flawed, yearning, and late. After that night, Redford began to withdraw from public life. He stopped giving interviews, stopped attending ceremonies. He was tired of pretending to be timeless. "I am not the myth," he once said. "I am just a man trying to end quietly." When Jane Fonda heard those words, she smiled through a kind of sadness only time teaches. "He's finally becoming who he always was," she said, the man behind the light. In 2018, when she received a Lifetime Achievement Award, Fonda spoke of him on stage, breaking decades of restraint. Her voice wavered slightly. "I've loved working with Robert Redford. He taught me about stillness, about how silence can hold more truth than words ever could." It was not a romantic declaration. It was something rarer, recognition, a love distilled into respect, a grief disguised as gratitude. After that speech, Redford sent her a handwritten note, short, almost shy. "Thank you, Jane, for seeing me even when I didn't want to be seen." She kept that note, framed in her study, beside a photograph from barefoot in the park. Two young faces laughing in the snow, unaware of the years ahead, unaware that their story would not end in embrace, but in echo. The revelation was not that they loved each other once. It was that they never stopped. It was a love stripped of drama, purified by distance, the kind that asks for nothing and gives everything. Hollywood often demands closure weddings, goodbyes, a final kiss. But life, as both of them learned, rarely offers that kind of symmetry. Sometimes, the only closure we get is understanding. And perhaps that was their true legacy, not the films, not the fame, but the courage to love imperfectly and still call it beautiful. Because in the end, Redford and Fonda didn't need to be lovers to belong to each other. They had something more permanent, a shared silence that stretched across half a century and said everything words could not. When the curtain finally falls on a life built before cameras, what remains is not applause, it is memory. For Robert Redford and Jane Fonda, that memory is not one of grand romance, but of something quieter, deeper, and infinitely more human, the stubborn tenderness of two spirits who never stopped searching for truth, even when it cost them love. They were never a couple in the ordinary sense. They did not share a home, or a scandal, or a single public confession, but they shared something rarer: continuity. Across decades, across marriages and revolutions, They continued to orbit each other like two distant stars whose light meets only in reflection. In a world obsessed with youth and noise, they offered another kind of beauty, the dignity of unfinished love. Theirs was not a story of conquest, but of endurance, proof that affection does not need ownership to exist, that understanding can be a form of intimacy, and that forgiveness, at the end of all things, is the purest confession of all. If you listen closely to their films, you can hear it beneath the laughter of Barefoot in the Park, beneath the stillness of our souls at night. It is the sound of two people saying, "I see you," without needing to say, "I love you." In the twilight of their lives, both finally stopped pretending to be immortal. They accepted what every legend eventually learns, that the real rebellion is not defying the world, but accepting the truth of your own heart. Fame fades. Beauty blurs. But the courage to be vulnerable that survives every decade. And so, when Jane Fonda once whispered, "He taught me how silence can love," she unknowingly wrote the last line of their shared story. It ends not with a kiss, but with understanding. Not in the glow of youth, but in the quiet mercy of age. Because sometimes, the greatest love stories are not about how people come together, but how, even apart, they never truly let go.